Let's get started. Welcome back from Reading Week. In today's class, we are seeing what we're getting more into EGS templating and really getting into every aspect of using it. Now, this is where we get into uh, making our components reusable. I would recommend following along today. And if you're doing so, on Blackboard, there's lesson 8 class code. Within that, there'll be two folders, the final and the starter. So the final is our final product, and the starter is what we'll use to get started today. So just open the starter directly in VS Code. If you open the folder correctly, then in VS Code, you should see the name of the folder up here, and then your files directly under it. Okay, if you want to do that later, that's fine too. You also will find a PDF on, one second, you'll find a PDF on Blackboard, which is called Guide to Templating. And I am recording today's lecture, so it should help you all because this is the first time we're getting into using something called partials. That's what our reusable components are. So on Trini's suggestion, I think I'll try to record these lectures that would be helpful that you can look back to. Okay. Yeah, so not besides the recording, I was saying that this guide to templating one should also help you understand the code and the process of how we went through every step. Okay, so I hope that helps. You can always also reach out to me if you're stuck, but try to do that before your assignments, as I always say. Templating. So what we will be seeing is setting up templates, how you can include EGS in your files in different manners, how you can use Express to use EGS so then you don't have to import two files separately, and how you can pass data, how you can pass variables and values from your server to your front end, okay? Injecting and accessing variables. So in order to make sure you have EGS installed in your system, or to make sure you have the modules that you require, even if it's EGS or MongoDB, Express, whatever you need, when you create your Node.js application, by default, you'll have this node modules folder, package lock.json and package.json, right? Inside package.json, you have the files, or you should see the dependencies that you have installed for your project manually, and any other packages that come along with Node.js by default should be under package lock.json. And all of these modules you will find under the node modules folder. So one way to know if our starter project folder currently has Node.js, EJS and Express installed or no, is you can go under node modules and search for the folder. So we have EJS as well as Express in your starter folder that's provided. I'll go back there, EJS as well as Express. Now, if you want further details about these modules, if you go into package.json, down here, you can see dependencies. So inside dependencies, you can see that this is the version of EJS and Express that we have. Okay, I'll give you a second. Now that's our setup so far. Because the folder is provided to you, we have all of these modules. But if you're working on your own project tomorrow and you need to install any of these modules, the way to do that is by in your terminal in VS Code, inside your project folder, you can run this command. Okay, you need to make sure you're in that folder directly. I know here it says lesson 8 class code. That's because I was preparing for this class. Currently, you'll be in lesson 8 class code / starter folder, right? So that is our current project folder. If we didn't have EJS inside our node modules or our packages information, then we could have installed it using this command, npm install EJS. Save basically means, I think it is to save the package that you're installing, but even if you don't use the save keyword, it will still get installed correctly. All right, and this is what your folder structure for your Node.js application should always look like. It's a mandatory thing that you need to follow. And depending on your rubrics, it might, in general, I'll always give you feedback if your folder structure is incorrect. And we'll start from the bottom. The first thing that we have is server.js. This is our main guy. He's going to run, or they're going to run all of our server files, all of our routes, and how we can access our CSS, our EJS files, everything, all the permissions, all the setup will be done in server.js. As we discussed, package.json is where you'll see details of your project as well as the modules that you've installed. Package lock.json gives us information about all other modules that we've gotten by default from Node.js. Now, these files we've seen in the past. Okay, what's new around here is this subfolder. So we have views. Inside views, we had our get Pokemon.ejs in week 5, correct? So under this, you had your portfolio.ejs files for coding challenge 5. Inside that, you have two subfolders, layouts and partials. What layouts are is they allow you to define common structures like headers and footers, and partials, one second, um, allows us to create our reusable components. So I believe in our semester, we're not really creating layouts, we're doing a lot of partials. So as you can see by the file name itself, we have footer.ejs, head.ejs, header, and a user list. So these are components that I know across my multiple pages, like home and about page, I will, or I could reuse the head, the header, the footer, and so on, right? So inside my views, I have these two subfolders. For now, let's focus on partials, inside which I'm going to add all of my reusable components. Any of my other main files, my main pages that have unique information, that is going to be our, like a home page, about page, the main content is different. Those files will be directly under views. Okay, if we go back to VS Code, you'll see that under views, partials is a subfolder. We have home, okay, and about.ejs. Both currently look like HTML, and we'll get to adding data to it and modifying the appearance of this. And we won't use layouts, so for now I can remove it. Partials has head.ejs, and all of these components we'll add value, add information to, and we'll see how we can link it to our main EJS files. So this is what your folder structure would look like. Okay, so now that we've installed and we know that our project folder does have the EJS module, one of the ways to include it in your project, just like we've done before when you're working with Express, the first line in server.js has been import Express from Express. That means we are importing the Express modules and all of its functionalities from the module that we've installed. So we're importing all of Express's functionalities, its capability for rendering our files, running our code over the server from the EJS module that we've installed, okay? We do the similar thing just like we did for Express. We can do it for EJS as well. And that's one way how you can use EJS in server.js to render any of your files, all right? Okay, so one way to render EJS is, we've seen EJS briefly again in week 5, but one way to do it is inside your root. If you just want to, for some reason, display a message like hello world, okay, one way to do it is you don't need to create a separate file. You can do it in server.js itself inline, all right? So the way to do that is ejs.render, and then you can directly put your HTML tag within it using back tags. Now, back tags, what they are is, this might look like a single inverted comma, but it's actually back tags, which you might find on your keyboard above your tab button. Okay, so you use, sorry, backticks. You use backticks, and within that, you'll have your HTML tags. And you'll notice this part over here, user.name, along with these pointed brackets and percentage signs. This isn't part of your HTML. It, in fact, is our EJS. Let me highlight it. Change that so it's more visible. Okay. So this user.name is a way to access this user object. So we have a user object somewhere which has perhaps the user's name, their username, their email address, and so on. Okay. Within that JavaScript object, okay, or maybe a JSON object, you have different properties. So in here, we are trying to print out that this user, so this user whose name is so and so, is this many years old. All right. So in order to insert the value in here from some object, we are using EJS syntax. All right. Inside our server.js file itself. Now, the reason I don't want to get into an example of this is because we'll see a better way of doing this. But my point over here is that you can, if you want to do maybe debugging or some sort of testing, you can use EJS templates inline by using this line within one of your routes. Okay, so an inline templates are created inside the server's root function. The EJS object has a render function, and that is used to create inline templates. So you need to make sure if you've imported EJS module in your server.js file, within your root, if you're trying to render some EJS value, variable, functionality, whatever it might be, you call the EJS module dot render. So a render is a function that we are using from the EJS module. Okay, so now that we have imported this, we have access to this function. So EJS.render this HTML tag where we are inserting dynamic values. Now, why is this better than using this particular line directly in your HTML files, like Tom is 30 years old, something like that? The reason being is within your roots, you can also have a for loop. And if you're getting data from a separate JSON file, like we saw, like the Kim Kardashian votings and all of that, Johnny T and everyone. When you have multiple files like that, you can use a for loop, or even if you're getting your data from MongoDB, you can use a for loop to use this one line to print out multiple lines of different information. Okay, so if you're using EJS templates inline, this is one way to do it. The render function accepts in HTML strings. So we can use these tags to display the user's name in this case. So we're using the strong tag in order to make it a little bold. And optionally, you can also have variables like we've done here, calling the user variable and the property of name and age within it. So this is one way of using EJS templates inline. Second way is using external files. Just like with CSS, JavaScript, and now even EJS, there's always two ways to do it. You can do it within a certain file itself, inline, or you can have it externally written, okay? So in this example here, we are using the EJS module again in order to render our EJS file. So in our previous example, we were just using the function render, but now since we have an external file called home.ejs, we are referring to it using the render file functionality. And to it, the user object that we are using in our previous example, we've passed the entire object to the front end. So now once you have rendered the file, you need to give this information back to the server that, hey, this is the file that I was trying to render, and that's the response. RES stands for response. I want to send back to the user. So once EJS has actually processed the code you've written, you are sending that back to the user. So that's what they see on the front end. They will see that, okay, this Tom is 30 years old. That's coming from home.ejs. That is the response that is sent back. All right. Now, render file functionality is going to wait till this external file. So this code, again, will be in our server.js under some root. Okay. And it'll get clearer when we start implementing an example. But right now, home.ejs is an external file. Unlike our previous example, our code was right here. All right. So JavaScript, as we know, is a single threaded browser engine. Okay. So it's going to go line by line to read your code. In this case, it was easy for us to just write our EJS and proceed. But in this example, we can't move on until our server code has gone and rendered or gotten a file that's not within server.js itself. Okay, it's an external file inside the views folder and so on, which is why we use the await keyword. So in our earlier on classes, we learned a lot of asynchronous JavaScript. What was the point of that? Is that you make sure your code doesn't proceed synchronously until a certain file has been rendered. So our server root might have the async word, async word, and here we'll use the await keyword. This means we don't want the response to be set, the HTML variable to be sent back as a response. We want to make sure we wait till EJS has actually completed rendering this external file. We've passed the variables to it. And once we receive a response back from EJS saying that, okay, I have sent the user variable to home.ejs and rendered the file correctly. After that, um, that rendering gets saved in this HTML value, and that's what we send to the front end as the output. That's what the user then sees. Have we understood how we can link EJS files and why would we link it internally and externally? Inline and external file-wise? Okay, you get the point of using await, right? So the file-based templates are utilized inside server root function. The EJS object has a render file function and it's used for file-based templates. The render file function accepts a file path. So you need to specify that we want to render home.ejs. Now, to that point, you must have noticed that inside our VS Code, if you remember correctly, inside the views folder, we had home.ejs. Unlike with HTML, we are not specifying that over here. Now, this is where the folder structure must really be followed and comes in handy. When you're using EJS templates, because you're using the render file functions, you're using the Node.js application project folder structure, your server knows that all of your EJS files are going to be inside the views folder. So you don't need to specify the entire path like you would usually with HTML. EJS knows, or your server.js code knows where to look. So if you've done your folder structure correctly, you can directly specify that my EJS file is home.ejs, all right? So the render file function accepts a file path string and optionally an object. So this is our object user. You don't always need to pass some data to it. Maybe you're running an about.ejs page. There is no multiple user data that you need to print out there. It's just some hard-coded information. In that case, you can just end your function with a rounded bracket over here. You don't need to do comma user. All right. So if you do want to send some information from the server, from the database to the server to the front end, then you can do that by passing a variable after your inside your render file after specifying the file name. Else, basically, this is optional. You don't have to pass a variable to the front end. All right. And the function is asynchronous and returns a promise. Okay, so an alternate to using or having to import once EJS is installed, instead of having or decreasing your lines of code, instead of importing EJS from EJS, another way to do it is if you've imported the Express module, you can simply have this line written after it because Express.js already it acts as a middleware for EJS, which means it supports EJS by itself. So you don't need to separately import EJS from EJS. You can simply use the Express module, okay? So app.set view engine EJS. If you use this line, you don't have to have that import EJS from EJS line before, okay? This line does the same thing. So it's an alternate way of how you can use EJS. Within that, if you do so, okay, the difference is import EJS from EJS. It means that you are referring to this variable that is holding the EJS module's functions and information. And that is how we were able to use the render and the render file functionality. If you do go ahead and choose this way of doing it, like app.set view engine using the EJS module, then thereafter you're going to have to specify Yeah, sorry. You're going to have to specify app.get. It's an asynchronous function that has request and response. And now because this root or this app variable is handling everything, instead of using the EJS variable on there, you need to use response directly. So instead of using EJS.render file, you'd be using response.render, all right? Because in this root already app has access to the EJS middleware. So Express.js ships with an EJS render middleware. What this means is you can use Express.js to easily render web pages or HTML content with dynamic data, which essentially is our EJS files, which is one of the templating engines that Express.js uses. So in Node.js is our language. Express.js is a framework we are using along with it. And EJS is one of the templating engines that works hand in hand with Express. Okay, so they all support each other. So because Express supports EJS, you can simply have this line of code. So this can be activated by setting the view engine property on the application. And the render function is then called on the result instead of the EJS object. This would allow you not have to import the EJS package at the beginning of your code. You can simply use Express.js by itself. Injecting variables. Let's just get started with coding and we can get to that part. So I'm going to have this side by side. So you know how to walk through the PDF as well, and it helps me teach. Let's see. You can mainly focus here. If the font of this is too small for now, it's okay. But let's review our starter code. Inside our starter code, we've seen the folder structure. Let's go over what's inside our files. In server.js, okay, in server.js, we've imported Express from our Express module. Why do we know Express is, how do we know we have the Express module installed? Can someone tell me? What's one way to check if this node module currently exists in our project? Where do I go looking? Node modules. Correct. So you can, one way of seeing that is going into node modules. Do we have that module installed? Yes, we do. All right. So now that we know that is there, this code will work. Then the other stuff we've kind of seen in our previous classes, you set the port number. That's where your server code will run on localhost port 3000 when we are coding locally, right? Or just on our computer. App Express, it basically creates an instance of Express that we use. Within this instance, we set the view engine to use the EJS middleware. So now app holds all the functionalities provided by Express as well as EJS. Okay, so this will sort of be a standard code that you will use if you're working on Node.js. All right, this is your general setup. And at the end, you'll always call your app.listen port to make sure basically that our server is running on the port that we've specified. So this last functionality and these couple of starting lines, okay, lines 1 to 7, is what's always going to be included in your server code. Okay, it's standard, it's mandatory, and as long as you've set your folder structure correctly, as well as you have your modules, necessary modules installed, you'll always have these lines of code. Now, what will change, what's different are these roots over here. Currently, because we know inside views, you have two files been provided to you, home.egs and about.egs. In order to render both these files, going back to server.js, we have two roots created so far. The default root is signified by a simple /. So response.render home. Can someone tell me why I'm using response? Render is an EJS function. Shouldn't I be doing something like this? Like if I try to run this line of code, will it work? What's the issue? What's the difference between this and using response.render? What's the point of using response? Why have we used EJS? Like, can someone tell me? So anyone wants to give it a shot? Do you remember why we are using response and not EGS?
Is it because they're using Express instead of EGS?
Correct. So over here, we don't have something like import EGS from EGS. Instead, what we've done is used Express, okay, and built on the instance of Express that we created, we used it to call EGS. So Express acts as a middleware, like we just saw, for EGS, and it basically supports EGS templating itself. Instead of calling another module, what we did is just made use of the one that we've installed, okay, and we are then using that. Okay, 1 second. So we are creating a route with the instance of Express, and within that, because Express is already supporting EGS templating for us, we can just use the response variable that we have inside our asynchronous function in order to render our home file. So one way to call your EGS files is, again, you don't need to call it like this. You don't need to have views/home.egs. You can call it directly by its file name, or another way to write it, like we saw in our previous example, is by running home.egs. Okay, so you can directly call the file name or file name.egs. And what follows is this empty bracket. If you don't want to pass any variable to the front end, that's fine. All you need to do is response.render. And in our about, if you do want to pass some value, then that would go in here, something like user. Okay, if you had to pass some information to our front end, let's go and see what home needs. Does home require a user right now? If you go and see the home.egs file that's provided to you, it's basic HTML. We haven't started integrating the user information yet. So we don't need to pass anything to our front end, to our home file. So we can actually just have this be like this. Same for about, it's currently empty, so you don't need to pass anything. You can simply write your code just like this. Let's see. So we went over the home route as well as the about route, constructed similarly. Just the difference is, of course, the file names. Here we're rendering home.egs, here we're rendering about, and also the routes. If you have two routes with the same root name, then about the second one will probably get rendered. The reason being is because, again, JavaScript is going to be read line by line. The last thing that it would read is that, oh, the default root must render the about page. Okay, so this kind of gets overwritten, which is why if you want to display or have these two files rendered separately, you must have their root names be different as well. So our default root will show us home.egs, and if we go to localhost 3000/about, then it will render the about page for us. If we go and check our about.egs file, that also currently looks similar to our home.egs, and we just have a different heading. The rest of everything is the same. So let's start adding code to it. Okay, to begin with, let's go back to server.js and see if we were to pass some information to the front end, how can we do that? Let's create a user that we can pass to the front end. Okay, I'll do that here. Let's say we have a user variable, so var user, and we'll pass some values in it, some property. So let's say our user's name is Jane. Okay, maybe her first name is Jane. So first name. Then we have another property, last name, maybe Doe. And that's one way you have, like, this is how much we've built so far. Okay. What you can also have is an object within an object. So maybe her birth information. So her birth date. Okay, we can create another object out of inside it. And the way to do that is, again, using curly brackets within. So let's say maybe her birthday is today. So 4. Okay, we can specify the month. So March is 3. And the year, let's say 1995. Okay, so we've already closed this bracket. Our user object is ready. The reason I'm getting this red squiggly line, can anyone identify the error for me? Why am I getting a red squiggly line here? I'm missing something tiny. Yes, comma on line 15 is missing. which is why that error was coming. So make sure you don't miss out on things like that. If you do get that red squiggly line, just try to see if you missed something or misspelled something. Okay, so we've created this variable user. And now that we have that, okay, we have our object ready, we can pass all of these multiple properties to the front end. Does anyone remember how we could do that from our PPT examples or our previous code? How can I pass the user variable to the front end? If I want home.egs to render this information, print out maybe Jane Doe is born on so and so, how can I do that? We are rendering our file on line 20 over here. How do I pass the user variable to the front end? Okay, from the PPTs, we saw that the way to do that is by using, yeah, a comma. And then within curly brackets, you can specify two things. First thing is, what are you expecting the front end? So inside home.egs, what are you calling this variable? It doesn't necessarily need to be user. In home.egs, you can also call it user info or whatever, ABC, doesn't matter. The first value or variable name that you specify is what home.egs will use to refer to this user object. So let's say for now, maybe it's user Jane, okay? And within that user Jane, if you want to, uh, and within user Jane, the second value that you need to pass to the front end is the object that you're sending from the server, all right? So the second object would be user. So basically what this does is let's test it out and see how we can change it. So maybe let's try to print out the first name in home.egs. Going back to home.egs, and I'll come back to the server file. Within here, let's print out maybe create an h2 tag, and using egs syntax, let's say, okay, egs syntax, the way to write it or to print out a variable value is pointed bracket percentage sign equals to, that's your opening tag or your opening bracket. And at the end, you'll have percentage sign and closing pointed bracket. Within here, you can call the user Jane variable and specify that you want the first name property from that object. As developers, as we have created or we are currently working on this project, we know that this user Jane variable or this user information holds certain properties like first name, last name, their birth date, day, month, and year. Now, because we are working on this project, we know this information is available to us. And from the user Jane object that our front end, that our server code has provided us, we are trying to access the first name property. Let's try to run this and see if we're doing good so far. So the way to do that is, okay, you select the server.js file in VS Code, and you have a function called run and debug. Just click on it and run and debug your server.js file. The first time you're running your project in VS Code, it'll ask you what kind of environment you want to run it in. Always select Node.js. Okay, it says started on port. I forgot to mention port 3000. I'm just going to go back and do that. Within curly brackets, sorry, $, curly brackets 3000, sorry, port. We can just call the variable. Let me expand this. Because we are using backticks and not single inverted commas, this variable gets rendered the way it does. If you're using single inverted commas, it'll just, your JS code will just presume it's part of the string. So the way to make sure, okay, I'm gonna maybe refresh my server here and you'll see the difference. Right now, it's just saying server started on port. It's not printing out my variable's value, it's printing out its names. So we need to make sure we're using backticks if you want to print out a variable. And refreshing a server, now it's started on port 3000. Let's see what we have. Localhost 3000. So we are seeing that we have home that's hard-coded, right? Hard-coded in the sense we've actually written inside our home.egs file. We have an h1 tag within which we've written home. Jane, however, the first name of our user is what's coming from our server code. So we passed an object. We created an object called user, and we passed it to the front end like so. So within response.render, when my home.egs file is getting rendered, I am passing a variable that home.egs is going to refer to as user Jane. And I'm passing this user object that we created to the front end. Had we not done this, had we forgotten to pass our users information, and if we go back to home.egs, you see that we still have our EGS syntax. Let's say something, you're going through your code and you are expecting your home.egs file to render this user Jane's first name. However, your server code is not passing it to the front end. So what can happen if that takes place? Currently, we don't have any error handling. We are just trying to simply print out the user's information. So what you'll see is an error. And it does point out where the error is, but basically you need to make sure that, I'm going to stop my server for a second. You need to make sure that you are sending your code to the front end, because sometimes if the code is provided to you, you might wonder, oh, well, I created a user. I'm trying to print that user's information, let's say user.firstname, but it's not getting printed in the front end. Instead, I'm getting an error. The reason being is because we haven't passed that user object. Now that we've understood that, for simplicity's sake, what I'm going to do is, instead of calling it user Jane, that's also not a nice variable name. So I'm just going to call it user. Okay, the user object that we have created, the user object that we have created, I'm simply passing that to home.egs to render it. So far, so good. Are we understanding? Are we getting any errors? Should we stop? Do you want to go over anything that we've covered so far? What we've looked at is how you can use EGS. One way to do that was importing that module itself. Else you can use Express, the instance that we create in for our roots altogether. We can use that itself to use the EGS middleware within it. And now we can just simply use the response parameter from our function in order to render our home file and pass some user information to it. And that's what we are printing out. Okay. While you're syncing that information, let's try to print all of this user object's properties, because we also have some object that's nested within our object. How do we access that? So now that in our default home root, okay, our default home root, we are passing this user object. Okay, so we are rendering home.egs and we are passing the user object to the front end. On the front end, so far, we are printing out, I changed this back from user Jane to user.firstname. So that's going to print out her first name. Let's say I want to print out Jane Doe, like her first name as well as her last name. In that case, I can use EGS syntax again. So I also get confused by it because it's unusual syntax. And sadly, I haven't so far been able to find anything like, you know how your VS Code helps you close your HTML tags? That way it doesn't. No, there isn't a shortcut. I would have loved to use it, but you need to just make sure you have the opening and closing right. I would recommend, as a general process now that you're getting started, is before adding any information or variable name or data between the opening and closing of your tags, just make sure you've created that correctly. Now we can go back within it and specify that within my user object, I want the last name as well. Now, again, just because there's space between the tags opening and the variable name doesn't mean it provides you that space in the front end. If you want a space between one object and property, like first name and last name, you need to add that between your variables getting rendered like I've done here. Okay, so now let's save this, run our server code again just to make sure we're still good and we don't have any errors. Okay, so home, Jane Doe, we are getting our users' information so far. Next thing we need to print out is simply the birth date. Okay, I'm going to change this to, actually, I'll keep it the same. In home.egs, I can now maybe let's have a paragraph tag. And let's say she's born on we'll just print out her birth date. So day, month, and year. Okay. The way to access it again is let's use our EGS syntax, and I'm going to actually copy paste it. So I'm going to create this. I'm going to copy it just so it's easier when I print out each variable and property. So I'm going to copy this within our EGS syntax, user dot birth date. Let me just check if I've spelled that correctly. Yeah. Birth date dot, I think we called it day, month, and year, right? So day, all right. So user dot birth date. So our object user, within that we have another object called birth date. Within that we have our property called day, if you remember, right? So inside user, I want to access the birth date, and from the birth date, I want the day. If you simply try to print out user.birthdate, you might get an error, and if you try to console log it, you will get a message saying that this is your user birth date object. But if you want that number to be rendered specifically, you need to specify which property it is. Like we did with our first name, last name, you call the property name, you call the key that's holding some value. I wouldn't call it property, it's key and value. So we call the first name key that's holding the value Jane. In order to print out 4/3/1995, you need to call that property specifically. So coming back to home.egs, the user is born on this day slash, I'm going to use EGS syntax again that I copy pasted, user.birth date. Within that, we have month. Following that, / again, EGS syntax copy pasted, user.birthdate.month. So you'll use this EGS syntax again to print out some variable name. It's different for other purposes if you were to use if-else conditions, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. Okay, I think we're getting to multiple users later in class. We'll do partials first. But now that we have printed out our object and each of the properties that we required and that we had, let's save this, refresh, and see what home.egs looks like. It started successfully on port 3000, no errors there. Coming back here, let's refresh. You can see that, oh, I printed out month again. I should have printed out year. All right, save this, refresh my server, come back, refresh my page. I can see that the user is born today, 4th March 1995. So that is how you can pass a variable to your front end. Let's get to using partials, okay? Partials, as we saw earlier, actually, I think we can go back to the PPT. Yeah. So partials are little snippets of templates, and they can be used to create your reusable components. And common examples are header, footer, metadata, maybe your navigation, so your menu, and a commonly used list, so maybe like a sidebar element. Those are often things that you can create reusable components out of. I don't know if this example is correct. Okay, the example here is that you have this header element where maybe you're printing out the user's first name and last name. Let's say you're creating your My Humber portal and you want to see the student's first name and last name in the portal, whatever page they go to. They could be checking their weekly schedules, their grades, etc. And every page you want the header to appear the same way. The header is not going to look different. The user's name is not going to change. So an element like this is what you can create a reusable component out of, okay? So that's a good example of if someone's logged in, you're getting that information that's verified from the database, and you want that same information, that same navigation to appear across pages, then this is one way of what you can store within your, let's say, header.egs partials, okay? Yeah, let's go back to VS Code and see how we can implement this. Okay, if you go back now, we are done with the server so far. if you go back to your partials folder, you can see we have these different files created for us, but they are currently empty. Home and about.egs, if I'm going to switch between them real quick, you'll see that the starting code or the starting information, the head, the doc type HTML, it's all the same. Okay, so why don't we just make reusable components out of them? What we can do is inside the home.egs file, home.egs file, we can simply cut this head element. So this entire head's opening and closing, I'm going to cut it. Actually, let's include the doc type HTML as well. Include all of this, and we can move that to head.egs. Okay, and save this. So inside head.egs, we have our starting HTML elements consisting of our HTML opening tag, doc type HTML, everything. Let's go back to this was the about page. So now that I've moved that, I can move that from home.egs as well. Okay, let me know if I'm going too quick. So far, what we did is in home.egs and about, anything and everything that was there from our head till from the starting of our HTML tag till the end of our head tag, we cut everything or we removed everything and we pasted it inside head.egs. Now, before we go on and create more reusable components, let's see how we can include that in our pages. Now that we've moved head.egs in a separate file, if we refresh this, go back, you'll see that I don't think so far we'll get any error, but I've not refreshed my browser page yet. Here we are seeing the title, week 9 home. If I refresh it, it just says localhost 3000. It no longer is printing out that title because we've moved it into head.egs, but we've not included it as a part of this code yet. How do we include head.egs, which is inside our partials subfolder and consists of part of our beginning code in our EGS main files? The way to do that is using EGS syntax again, but it's a little different from how we print out the variable name. So when we printed out the variable name, our EGS syntax had a pointed bracket, percentage equal to sign. Okay, the difference between printing out a variable using EGS syntax and including a file is you use pointed brackets, percentage sign, but instead of equal to, we'll use a minus sign or a hyphen. Okay, so if you want to include an external partials, you want to include a head.egs file, you will call it like this. Your opening tag will be like this, and then closing will be just the same. Okay, within this EGS opening and closing tag, which I'll again copy because we'll use the same thing in about.egs, right? Within this, you can call the include function or the include method and specify in rounded brackets with single inverted commas. Now you have to specify that in the views folder, I have my partials, right? Home.egs is already within views, so you don't need to specify that over here. However, you do need to specify that the file we're looking for is within the partials subfolder. So within the partials subfolder, we have head.egs, and that is what is holding our beginning code, our title, our meta tags, and everything. Okay, I'm going to copy this, save this file, and also paste it in about. And now if I save this, refresh our server, go back, and we are at home right now, localhost 3000, refresh, you can see that now this successfully changes back to week 9 up. Oh, it says about, 1 second. Yeah, it says about for the home page as well. Let me go back and see the about page. It says about as well. Can someone tell me why that might happen? We've included head.egs for both of our files, right? For about.egs, we've included the head as well as for home.egs. And in our partials, we have head.egs, which says this, okay? Now, the problem is, even though we have two separate pages whose titles should be different, home and about, we still have the same title in our head.egs that we are including. So this partials has the same title, and we are using the same head.egs file within both our home as well as about, which is the reason why we are getting which is why we are seeing the same title. Okay, we can change that by passing a variable to our head as well. Now, the way to do that is, give me a second to make sure we're on track. Okay. All right. In case you want partials, the head.ejs partials to get rendered here, but you don't want the same values to be printed out. You want to make it more dynamic. Make sure every page has a different title, just like you do with your server.js file, like we did out here. When we wanted to pass the user information, we passed it after the file name is being rendered. Similarly, in your home and about pages, what you will do is have a comma, and within curly brackets, you'll specify what is the variable. The first thing that you'll specify is what is the variable that head.ejs is expecting. In our previous example, instead of user over here, we had user Jane. But for now that we've understood it, we'll not call it something crazy. We'll have the same variable that we want printed out in our head.ejs file. So let's say maybe that's page, or let's call it title actually. All right. And the title for my home.ejs page should be home. All right. I'm going to copy the same syntax, the curly brackets and the comma, save this file, go back to about.ejs, and here as well, in this EJS syntax where I've included my partial, I want head.ejs to print up. I want head.ejs to, okay, I can just paste it, print out the title for this page to not be home, but to be about. Now, simply passing this variable has never been enough. We need to also make sure this title is being rendered where it's supposed to be received. Now, so far, again, if you refresh it, you shouldn't get an error. You are passing some variable, but it's not being used. All right. If your head.ejs is expecting a variable and you haven't passed it, so if your EJS file is expecting a variable and you haven't passed it, you'll get an error. If you're passing an error, if you're passing a variable, but you're not using it, that's fine. Basically, provide information to your files. Using it or not is your file's choice, if that makes sense. If it doesn't, that's fine. But what we need to change here is this about word. Okay. Our title should say week 9, home for the home page and about for the about page. So inside our head.ejs file, let me just confirm the syntax should be the same. Head.ejs. Okay, I don't have it in the PDF, but it should be the same. To print out a variable that is being passed here, I'm going to call our EJS syntax just like we've done with our other variables. Else we'll go look up the documentation. But the variable that we are passing here is title, right? In our about page, when the head.ejs partial is being rendered, we are passing in some string, and that variable is being held by this variable name on both pages. Okay, now that we have that, let's save. Okay, we are printing out the title variable out here. Refresh our server. Go back. The about page says about. And let's see what the home looks like. Now the home page says home in the title as well. So even though we are using the same header or the head of the page for both files, the title is different. So this is how you can pass variables. We've seen server.js and how we can pass user information, but this is how you can make your pages look dynamic, even though you're just using that one head of your HTML head across multiple pages. Does this make sense? Do you see the scalability and how you can write less lines of code? Now, if I want to go back and maybe I've linked CSS and it's not correct, or maybe I forgot to add meta tags, I don't need to go to both of my pages or my multiple pages. All I need to do is go into my partials and fix or tweak whatever styling or font information I have that I want to change. All right. Another example of this is if you don't want to pass any variable to the front to your partials, you don't have to. Let's say we also want to create a footer. So footer, let's say 2024, copyright, Humble, MMDD209. And this is a footer that I want to see across both of my pages. So I'm going to cut it and put it inside footer.ejs. Paste it here. And now that this footer partials is ready, I can include it in both of my files. So within the body tag itself, okay, in the middle here, this is where ideally our footer would be printed. So let's simply use our EJS syntax to include a partials and external EJS file. And the way to do that, just like we have an example here, actually, let's do it here because we have the comparison. To print out a variable, we had an equal to sign, but if we want to include a partials, the syntax changes from equal to minus. And within this, I can specify that include, within include, I want inside the partials folder, I have something called footer.ejs. I simply want that rendered. My footer is not expecting, I'm going to copy paste this to about as well. My footer is not expecting any value. I don't need to pass any value to it. Okay, save. I don't have any more changes to save. I'll refresh my server, refresh my page, and we can see our footer now. Is anyone getting any error or some part isn't understood? We'll quickly see one more topic and we can go over any other doubts, any doubts if you have it. Before we proceed, actually, let's try to include a header as well. Let's say you're trying to create a navigation. How would you do that? So inside, again, going back to home.egs, inside the body of your HTML page, you might have your header tag in here. In here, let's say you have your navigation and an unordered list. Let's quickly make it so that we can switch from home.egs to about really quick, because right now we need to go and access those routes, right? So instead of doing that, we can create our header element, a navigation tag, within which we have an unordered list of clickable items. So let's say anchor tag, let's say that wraps around our list item. Our list item is firstly our home page. I'm going to copy paste this. And our second page is about. All right. This would have probably come in handy if you wanted to create a multiple page website for your coding challenge 5, which is where you created that one page portfolio. But if you wanted to create multiple pages and navigate through them, unlike with HTML, where you use ref and you'd be like about.egs, okay, because it's in the same folder. If you want to access or make a clickable link so that actually this is home, so home.egs. If you want to make a clickable link so that when I click on home, I'm taken to home, or if I am clicking on about, I'm taken to about.egs. This is not the way to do it. In HTML, yes, you need to specify the file name. However, in EGS, even though it might look like HTML, the way to make your navigation is you need to specify the root, not the page name, but the root. So we know that home.egs is getting rendered. What's our root look like? It's our default root, which is simply /. So when you're specifying your navigation inside your reference attribute for your anchor tag, you need to specify that if the user is clicking on home, they are taken to this default route. All right. On the other hand, if they are clicking on the about button or the about part of our navigation, they should be taken to the about route. In server.js, we know that these are the two routes we've created. Let me minimize this for default one and about. Now that we've created this, I'm going to actually cut it. Okay, this header that we created. Now the benefit of, again, using EJS templating is that we don't need to create this element again in about. We can simply make this element once. So I'm going to paste the header here and reuse it across both our pages. Now, as you remember, this folder structure again is very important. You need to have, because of the navigation we are using, your files need to be in the same folder under views, and all of your partials go in a subfolder. All right. But when this partial gets included in home.egs, it's easier for it to navigate and access those routes that render these pages. All right. So coming back to home.egs, I'm going to move this. If you had a navigation for your page, you would include it before the main information of your page, right? Users information or where your heading tag is, you'd have it at the top of your page. So right after the opening of our body tag, let's include our header EJS partial. Can someone tell me how I would include or write or call out to my navigation? What's the syntax I would use here?
Angle bracket,
Yeah.
percentage sign,
Correct.
then minus.
Correct. And I'd close it just like we usually do. In here, we can include, yeah, typo header dot egs. Okay. And I can simply copy paste the same line of code inside about as well. Now that we've done this, let's see if we have printed, if our roots work. So I'm going to refresh, minimize, refresh, and we have our unordered list of clickable items. We are currently on the home page, which is our default root on localhost 3000. If I click on about, I'm taken to the about root. You see that the root up here changes as well. If I want to go back to the home page, I can click on home and it takes me to the default root. So again, with EGS, you need to specify the root that's rendering a specific file and not the file name itself. Okay, let's save this. Do you want a break? We have a last topic to go through. Break? All right. So it's 9:20. Let's get back at 9:30.
Oh, no, it's very tough. It looks like it's very tough. Yeah.
Okay,
Oh, you might, the Rubik's Cube idea.
let's resume. Our last topic for today is loops or conditionals, loops and conditionals rather. When you'd use this is so far we've only seen if one user's information got ran. We've seen how to include a user's information on the front end. We've seen how we can include partials to make reusable components, but there might come a time when you need to print out multiple users' information. So the way to do that is by using for loops. Okay, so template variables are not always simple type. Sometimes they are lists of data or arrays of data. To handle this type of data, you must be able to iterate through the different values that you have, all the different first names, last names, and date of births. So for using the for each or a traditional JavaScript for loop, you can create reusable components with dynamic data. So the for loop that you would be using for this data or the if else condition is pretty much the same way how you do it in regular JavaScript. The only thing is you'd be doing this in the front end where you in your EGS files. So within that, again, probably a last and final variation of using EGS syntax is out here. So if you wanted to include partials or include another what is it called? EGS file, we'd be using pointed brackets. Okay, maybe let me open a notepad. But if you want to show a variable in EGS, the syntax would be something like this, right? So pointed bracket, percentage sign, equal to, then you'd have your variable name and you'd close it like this. If you wanted to include partials, let me expand this a little. But if you wanted to include partials inside your EGS file, your EGS syntax would look something like this. Percentage sign minus, then you'd include the specific EGS file and you'd close it like this. Now, lastly, if you want to include any JavaScript, not just conditions, but variables, arrays, some other information on your front end, which is inside your EGS file, then you would call your JavaScript code like this. So JS would be called without anything. Without anything. So just what I mean by that is not an equal to, and you don't need a minus sign as well. Simply pointed bracket, percentage sign, and to close it after your JavaScript, again, percentage and pointed bracket closed. Okay, so these are the three variations of EJS syntax that we have seen or will be using so far. If you're ever confused or want to use more of it, then EJS documentation. All right, if you search for EGS documentation, get started, you can see somewhere here, yeah, all the tags of how you can include. So scriptlet tag as in for control flow, no output for JavaScript. This is how you'd open your EGS tags. For white space, you'd use an underscore. For outputs from variables that are coming inside your HTML template, you'd use equal to, and so on. All right, closing is always like this. If you ever want to get more into EGS, I recommend going through the documentation. I don't think it's a lot if you're already well acquainted with JavaScript. It should be, and Node.js now, it should be easy for you to integrate this. Coming back, so you can, that is how you can include for loops or any other loop that you want to do using JavaScript is by using this EGS syntax. If you observe it properly or like correctly, we have an unordered list over here. So we have a variable fruits that's holding an array of different string values, so apples, pears, and oranges. And inside our EGS syntax, we have an unordered list. Okay, so we are using the for loop for our unordered list like this. Pointed bracket, we are calling a for loop. Now, curly bracket, and within this, you'd ideally print out your variable value or you'd have some action, right? But every line that you have your EGS syntax in or with, you'd have to close that line and that line itself. So you can't not have this EGS closing tag over here and then have your LI, your list item, you'll get an error. You need to start and close your EGS tags on the same line. Is it just me or y'all are feeling cold too? Got chilly suddenly, right?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a little distracting. Sorry. I did not think of that, but thank you now. But yeah, so on every line, when you're using EGS syntax, you need to close it right there. You can't proceed to trying to print out this list item without closing your EGS syntax. So make sure on every line that you'll ever see, you need to open and close your EGS syntax. Okay, so here we've opened it, closed it. Here we've opened it and closed it. And within our for each function now, we are rendering or we're trying to print out each fruit's value. So within that, again, now the EGS syntax changes because we're trying to access information from a variable. So we are using, through this fruits array, we are using a for loop. And within that, we are targeting each specific fruit on every position. And we are printing that out in our list item. So the EGS syntax changes because here we are still printing out a variable or a value from our array, right? So from our array, we created a variable, and this is going to point towards and hold each of these values one by one in our for loop. And when you're trying to print it out, your EGS syntax again has that equal to sign. And when you want to close, you're done with your for loop or your if else conditions, you'll again close it using EGS syntax, and you need to start and end that over here. So getting used to the syntax is tedious, no doubt, but it'll take a second to get used to. But if you don't close your for loops, or you forget to open them, or you forget to use any of this EGS syntax, most likely you'll get an error. It should point you towards this bracket's not closed or EGS syntax expected here. Try to go to that line and you should be able to identify that you've missed out on an opening or closing tag and so on. So just like we saw for loops, you can also have if-else conditions inside your EGS files like this. Again, your EGS syntax will be the same. You'd use this JavaScript EGS opening and closing, which is basically without any equal to or minus sign and so on. And at each line, we are opening and closing our EGS syntax as well as our JavaScript. So if user, which means if there is a variable user holding some value, it's not null or it doesn't not exist, then you'll print, or sorry, if it exists, then you will print out that user's information. But if user is not true, or if user's null or empty, then you just simply print out user not found. So this comes in handy if you have a navigation, again coming back to our Humber example, where you want to have inside your header partials, maybe inside your partials, not necessarily your main EGS files. If you want to have if-else conditions, you can apply this there as well, wherein you print out the user's information if they are logged in. Maybe if they've logged in for testing purposes anonymously, or we don't have their information, then you can print out user not found, user not found. So this is one way you can use if-else conditions as well. Let's try to implement that in our code right now. Okay. The way we try to implement this is by creating multiple users. So coming back to, I'm going to close this. No, don't save. Coming back to VS Code, I'm going to stop our server for a second, close this terminal so we have more space. And let's work on server.js for now. So in server.js, I had minimized this. I'm going to open these roots over here. So you see that inside our app.get, our default root, we only have one user's information so far. Let's create 3. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it here. Actually, an easier, this is what I've covered in the PDF, but another easier way to do it might be var user, and then inside here, okay, I'm going to do some modification. I'm going to cut this. Okay, so all of our properties. Let's say within the user, we have user 1, and that's holding an object. We have user 2, and that's holding an object. We have user 3, and that shall hold an object as well. Okay, currently empty, but we have no red squiggly lines. It's looking good so far. Now within this, what I cut, I'm going to paste. Okay, so within the user 1 object, I have first name, last name, date of birth is in user 2. I'm going to paste again. And I don't know if I've mentioned this in class earlier, but you see that the indentation of this code is a little off because we cut and paste it. There is a shortcut that you can use to make your HTML, CSS, or JavaScript code better align, and you don't need to do that yourself. If you right click, there's an option called Format Document. The shortcut is available right next to it. For me, it's Shift Alt F. Simply doing that moves things to where they should be, so your code becomes more readable. Okay, so just a tip. Saving this, now we have 3 users. Just to make it a little different, just to make it different, let's change it. So first we have Jane Doe, maybe then we have Ken Doe, Frank Doe. Okay, and let's also change their birth. Make this 12, 12, 97, maybe 24, okay, 24, 5, 1990, okay, or whatever it needs to be. But now the point is that we have an object user with 3 further objects nested within it, or 3 keys that are holding other objects. And we'll save this, and we can go back to our home.egs file and see how we can render this information. All right. So earlier we just had the one user. So in home.egs, all we did is directly print out that one user's information. But now we know that we have multiple data users information coming in. So how do we print that out? Let's create our for loop. Okay, so the EJS syntax for JavaScript is pointed bracket, %, closing tag for it. Let's just make sure we're being clean. And I'm going to copy paste this later on. Our way of using for loops in JavaScript is first, let's create the for loop. So within user, was it singular or plural? Okay, it was singular. So I'm going to change it just for simplicity's sake to plural. So users instead of user, even here. All right, so I'm going to change this variable name that's holding all of our objects. And then when we are passing it to the front end, I'll change it. Now coming back to home.egs, we have gotten a variable called users from our server, right? So when home.egs is being rendered, we are passing in a variable called users for home.egs to use. And this variable, the second variable out here, is what's holding the value in the server. So we are passing that to the front end. And in here now we can call that variable and specify that for each user, okay, this is using that arrow functionality that we saw, or arrow syntax for your functions, like we saw, right? There are 2 ways to write your functions. You call function name. Another way to do it is like this. Basically, this is what your for loop will look like. You're calling your user's object. So for each user within it, I'm going to simply cut this. And to create a separation between each user, maybe let's have a div. And within that, we have each user's information. Okay, so their first name, space between their last name, and paragraph tag holding date of birth. Maybe let's say date of birth is so-and-so, that comes from our backend, and maybe name is like this. So just to recap, we created an object called users, which has 3 objects within it. Yeah, and now we are rendering home.egs in our default root. So in our default root, once we have created this variable, I'll minimize it. We are in response for the default root being called. We are sending back this response to our user, which is we are rendering the home.egs file within our views folder, and we are passing this user's information to it. Inside home.egs, we are not only rendering this page, we are also looping through our users variable, okay? And we are looping through users to print out each user's information. Can someone tell me any mistake within this code?
Should be users dot first name? Or
No. So the for loop is, I think it's fine because we are calling the users variable, and for each So we are using we are using this variable to refer to each individual object within this variable that's passed on to us. So the way for us, again, just going back to the PPT here also, in this example, we had an array of multiple values, right? And we use this, we call the array, and for each, this is your traditional function syntax. For each fruit, okay, we have this function which is going to print out our list item for us. Similar to this, right now we have our our code where we have multiple objects coming from the backend, and for each object, we are trying to print out the user. Yeah, so within this, do we have any error? Hint, syntax.
For the equal sign?
No, we are missing the closing. So as I mentioned, you must close your EJS syntax on every line. So for our JavaScript or for our variables, if we've started writing EJS syntax on this line, you must remember to close that bracket, right? Similarly, over here, we haven't opened the bracket. So let's do that. Shift Alt F. Things have moved around. 1 second. Move this back up. Okay, so and again, every line that you open or use your EJS syntax in, you need to make sure that you are, I'm just thinking if we'll get another error, but I was saying that in every line that you're initiating or starting an EJS syntax on that line itself, you need to make sure you're closing it. And if you're closing it on that line, you need to make sure it's started before it has been closed. Let's save this. I'm hoping there isn't an error. There might be. Let's try and see what we get. Refresh in our homepage, and yeah, I think the issue, okay, users for each is not a function. It is. We're getting an error here. I was suspecting that we are not pointing to, I'm going to try something. Just give me a second. Instead of creating an object of objects, because that might not work. Wait, let me try something else. What the issue might be is that, you see, we are calling different properties within it, but we are not referring to user 3, user 2, user 1. We are calling the user object that we created, and then technically we should be like, it should be users.user2.firstname. Get what I'm saying? If we're trying to access first name within user, you'd console log user2.firstname. Now, the problem here is I'm trying to print out all of these values, but I'm not calling these user properties. I think that's where the issue lies. So inside, I'm going to change my users variable from an array to an object. From an object to an array using square brackets to open and close it. And instead of having that user 1, 2, 3 that I created earlier, I'm just going to have multiple objects within. This should work. I'll save, refresh. And if this works, I can go over it again. Yeah, that works. So again, just to recap, the issue or the incorrect way of coding was that within, firstly, this was an object. So let me do that here just for clarity. If we have an object or if we have a variable called users, if we have an object within it, we need to, whatever property you specify, even here, first name, last name, you need to call that directly. In our for loop, we were not calling the user one key. We were directly going inside users, we want the first name. And that was the issue. So instead, what we did now is I kept our PPT example in mind of the apples and the fruits. And I created an array instead of having multiple strings. So let's go back here. Instead of having an array with multiple strings, okay, apple, pear, and oranges, I have an array now of multiple objects. Okay, objects are signified by these curly brackets. Arrays are the square brackets. All right. So now that we have one variable called users with three different users information, Jane, Ken, and Frank, save this, refresh. Okay, let's just check home.egs one more time. We didn't change anything here. We are simply still referring to the users array that is being passed to us, right? So in response, we don't have to change anything here as well. In response, we are sending back our users variable to the front end. The front end is referring to it and calling a for loop, pointing towards each individual object that we have inside our users, plural, variable. You're pointing to each for easier reference sake. We are saying that within users, we are calling each individual user and printing out their properties like first name, last name, and date of birth. Okay, so if we refresh this, go back to our server, you'll see that we have successfully printed out every user's information using for loops or JavaScript syntax within our EGS code. Now, last example is what if a particular user, let's say Frank, hasn't provided their date of birth? Okay, so let's remove this. If I save this, refresh our server, go back, refresh, you'll see that we get an error because for each in our home.egs file, for each user that we are trying to go through, we are expecting these properties, these keys and values to be provided. If they're not provided, then we can't send back a home page being rendered in response. Instead, we'll get an error that we are sending back to the front end. To avoid this, in case one of your fields are optional or you might not have something provided to you, in here you can have an if-else condition using JavaScript EGS syntax. The way to do that is, again, pointed bracket, percentage sign, pointed bracket again. Within this, I can specify my if-else condition that if user dot birth date has been provided. You don't need to specify each individual day, month, or year because we know that birth date is an object that should be provided. If we have birth date, then we'll definitely have day, month, and year. So if user birth date, which means if this is not null, if this is not missing, then and only then we want to print out this paragraph. All right. So we need to make, it can be a little confusing. So we need to make sure we open our curly brackets here, but we need to close it after this paragraph tag has been printed or not. Okay, so we'll close it over here using EJS syntax again. And by it, I mean the curly bracket for our JavaScript if-else condition. So if user birth date is a property that exists, it's not null, it has been provided, then and only then print out this paragraph. Okay, so I'm going to refresh the server, go back, refresh our code. And now you can see that every user's information has been printed out. Even though Frank Doe did not provide his date of birth, we still included him in our list of users that is being printed out. So that was all for class today. Just to recap, we saw how we can include partials, right? We saw how we can make these multiple reusable elements. We saw how we can use JavaScript for loop and if-else conditions as well. We saw also importantly, although it wasn't exactly part of the PPT, but we saw that if we create a navigation, so within our partials, header, how we can have one page be linked to another page by referring to their roots and not the file name, and what our folder structure should look like, and if we don't follow it, how it can give us errors. All right, that was all for class today. You do have an assignment being assigned to you. I wouldn't say good news, bad news. You do have an assignment being assigned to you, but I guess good news is that just like we did with assignment 1, your major assignments have 7 weeks. So this is your last major assignment, which is assignment 2, due in week 14, your last week. All right. I don't think I provided it on Blackboard, but let me just check. Assessments, assignment 2. I think I didn't provide. If I didn't, okay. Yeah, it is there. So CRUD application, the complexity of this application is a lot. So like you're going to include everything that we've learned so far. You will be using, so the first line that says you'll be using Node.js, Express, EJS, MongoDB. All right. I think this is a great portfolio piece for you. You're integrating complex technologies, you have a database, and you'll host it on AWS. So it's a very wholesome submission, final submission. You are expected to build an application using all of these technologies. And again, we haven't learned all of these technologies just yet. We are getting started. We have seen MongoDB separately in the recorded lectures. And in week 7, I believe, when we didn't meet because of family day. So you have that recording provided to you. Next week, we'll see how we can integrate MongoDB into our Node.js application. Meanwhile, you can think of your idea and maybe get started with coding the rest of the coding. So if you had users information coming from MongoDB, still what's your idea? What would your application look like? You can get started on that. What's important is you need to create an application that performs CRUD operations. CRUD means your application needs to be able to create, read, update, and delete, which means I should be able to create an entry, add information to your database. Let's say, again, you're trying to create, you're making a blog website. I should be able to create a blog or an article. Once I have inserted that article or submitted it, it's gone to the database. I should be able to read that article. It should show up on some page. It should show that okay, your information goes to the database, and then it shows me that information to the front on the front end. Those are your two functionalities: create and read. Update means if I've made a mistake or an error, I want to change something that I have submitted, I should be able to edit. All right. And delete is I should be able to delete my article. So those are 4 functionalities using all of these technologies that you should integrate. And these also we haven't seen so far. Once we learn how to integrate MongoDB, we can get into the operations of how you can integrate that with your application. The subject matter of your site is up to you, but the main content should be a series of articles that are added. So you can decide how you want to go about it. We'll also be implementing login registration in our upcoming classes, which is why I said the classes can get a little, now it gets the complexity. Now that we've built our basic knowledge on JavaScript, it's going to start getting a little, I wouldn't say tricky. If you just like turn in your coding challenges and focus and practice what we've done in class using the final and starter files, you should be able to implement these skills again in your application. Okay. The final and starter sort of walking hand in hand with you, walking you through the topics. This is where you try to do it yourself. Read through the instructions. I won't go over all of it. You need to have one image, different types of headings, etc. This might give you more clarity when we start doing this in the upcoming classes. But I'd say for today, just read it and try to think of your idea. Maybe make your HTML or EJS files and have your server set up, for if you've thought of what you want to make. You must have Node.js, Express.js, EJS, all of that. Go through the rubric. That's mainly what I will use for grading you. This is how your user should be able to log in. Like people who are, they should have, your articles that you include on your website should have an image, headline, subhead, author's name. These multiple fields are required. And yeah, just go over the instructions and the rubric as well. If you need any help with it, let me know. I think I had the critical path open somewhere. Yeah, here. So I've assigned your CRUD application to you. Coding Challenge 6 was due yesterday. We went through templating. Was it not? No? Oh, I changed the deadline. I don't remember. I didn't update it in the critical path then. Sorry. Sorry. Coding challenges 6. Yeah, sorry, it's due on Sunday, I believe, right? Yeah, next Sunday. My bad. I will update this. Okay, so it's due next week. Next week, you'll also be assigned Coding Challenge 7. But the point is, we did templating today. You don't have anything else assigned to you today, no coding challenge. Think about your assignment too, how you want to implement it. Maybe try to get started with your idea if possible. Don't keep it for the end. It can be a lot, please. In the next few classes, we'll really quickly go over how basically templating 2 is how we can integrate MongoDB. After that, this class will be how you can create your login registration. And this is when we'll cover the CRUD functionalities, create, read, update, delete. So by week 11, you will be equipped with everything you need to know for assignment 2. Following that, we'll have open class where we can go over again if you didn't understand login registration or CRUD functionalities, you're not sure of your idea or you're facing errors. We have plenty of time. So those will kind of be drop-in sessions. If you have questions, you can come by, or if we collectively decide that we want to go over this topic again, you drop me a message. I'll put out an announcement and we can have class, like open class. All right. So next 3 weeks, we'll really go through some heavy topics, and thereafter you're on your own, I want to say, but I'm still here to help you, but you need to start working on your assignment. Okay. That was all for class today. I recorded it. I will upload